13 minutes past 7. Morning
myself.
to you. You are watching BBC Breakfast. Let's talk about our main story. And just how the UK border will work after Brexit has been one of the critical points throughout negotiations with the European Union.
There's a report out today, though, which warns systems that need to be in place may not be ready in time should Britain leave without a deal. Joining us now to explain a little bit more about this from our London newsroom is Tony Smith, the former Director General of the UK Border Force. Tony, thank you very much for coming on this morning and trying to explain this to us. So, what are the issues, I think, from your point of view? What is not in place in the event of a no-deal Brexit?
Well, it's a very thorough report. They've been to all of the departments in Whitehall that are preparing for this, the Border Delivery Group. They've visited ports and airports. And what they're saying essentially in this report is we're not going to be able to do all the things we might want to be able to do by the end of March 2019. And the two big risks are really security, in we may not have access to all of the systems that we have now in the EU for security checks, and National Crime Agency has raised that one. And the other one is this movement of goods within the EU, customs checks, where we don't actually require manifests from traders moving goods within the EU. We do from outside, and whether or not we're going to have the capability by next year to be able to to introduce all of those new systems that will be needed for additional customs checks. So the report tries to set out some priorities really about what we do need to focus on the border, which I would have agreed with, which is firstly safety and security, and secondly keeping the border open and keeping people and goods moving freely across it.
Is there a staff shortage, Tony? I mean, how many extra people are needed to process this?
Well, yes, there is. There's a staff shortage, and there's a report indicates a weakness in our systems. The systems aren't integrated. There are a lot of legacy systems, so we rely a lot on IT. And so that's a worry. But yes, the Border Force budget has been cut year on year for 4 years. We've gone down in real terms about 7% in staff, and yet the volume of people has gone up by 15%, by goods by 17%. So in any case, the border was creaking a little bit in resources. So we are recruiting more staff, but it does take quite a long time to get them in, and they won't all be in post by the end of March.
Tony, what do you say? And I'm sure there's people watching this morning saying this is part of Project Fear, and a bit like the Millennium Bug. There's lots of concerns about what might happen, what could happen, and everything's going to collapse. In actual fact, quite a bit of that is groundless.
Well, I mean, I think we need to understand that it's up to us at the end of the day. It's up to our government what we do at our border. And if we want to implement greater checks, then we can do that. If we don't, then we don't have to. And so this tries to set out priorities. We've got a very good border. I think people need to realise the Border Force is the envy of the world in many respects. We have advanced freight targeting systems, a national border targeting centre. We move more people through e-gates in this country than any other country in the world. So we've got a pretty good border, but we're not going to be able to do everything. But for me, the bigger worry is what's going to happen on the other side, because, of course, we can't control what happens at the EU border when people arrive in places like France and Belgium and so on. So I'd like to see more work done bilaterally with those countries. We've always had good relationships with those on sort of potentially trusted trader, trusted traveller pilots, where we can keep goods moving, because the worst of all would be that the border grinds to a halt, and that's going to hurt significantly on both sides.
One of the rumours yesterday was we were hearing the government would urge freight companies, I'm sure you heard this as well, to use alternative ports if the first destination became full. Is that a credible idea?
Well, I mean, it's true that some routes are more loaded than others, and the industry will have to look at that. But the bigger problem for me is we don't know how the EU is going to treat cargo arriving from the UK at EU ports, and that in itself could cause gridlock. So quite often, when I was head of the Border Force, we got blamed for long delays in Operation Stack and M20. It wasn't anything to do with us. It was a blockade around the French ports because of regulations imposed on that side. And I think we really need to understand, in the event of no deal, well, what are we going to be able to do to persuade the French ports, the Dutch ports, and they're all gearing up and recruiting additional Border Force staff over there, I know, to persuade them to keep things, people and goods flowing, because that is the biggest challenge of all in my book.
One more question, if I could, because obviously this is talking about what happens if there's no deal. What happens if there is a deal? I mean, how does that change things?
Well, that extends it. You see, we get more time then. I mean, we're then talking about this transition period until the end of 2020. It doesn't necessarily mean that even by then we will have all of the systems in place. But if we get a deal, we can agree things like standards. You know, on certain products that already enter the EU, we can say, well, look, they've already been cleared to an EU standard. We accept those standards, and so therefore they can come through. They can be waved through at the UK side. So that's really what the regulatory process that will flow from a deal would deliver to us. At the moment, a no-deal process delivers all this uncertainty, and I think that's the real problem that this report is highlighting.
Good to talk to you, Tony. Thank you very much. That's Tony Smith, who is the former Director General of the UK Border Force, speaking to us on Breakfast this morning.
18 minutes.